Dune, Part 3. Summary of the book, The Messiah of Dune by Frank Herbert. What would you do if fulfilling your ambitions cost you what you love most? In Dune Messiah, Paul Atreides, the mythical Muad'Dib, faces the devastating consequences of his absolute power. With his empire built on blood and prophecy, and haunted by visions of destruction, Paul must make heartbreaking choices as his legacy, his love, and his humanity are shaken. Between betrayal, manipulation, and the inevitable price of his godhood, Paul is torn between his destiny and the ultimate sacrifice. Will he be able to escape the prison of his own making, or will he be consumed by the desert he once called home? Part 1. Arrakis, the Emperor's Golden Prison. Arrakis, also known as Dune, is a fierce planet, a vast desert where heat devours life and wind whips mercilessly. In this world of endless dunes and burning skies, a hostile and unforgiving place, every element of the environment seems designed to crush any hope. For the Freemen, the native inhabitants, survival here means a constant struggle against the elements, a battle for every drop of water, the most precious and scarce resource of all. They roam the vast sands clad in stillsuits, sophisticated garments that recycle every trace of bodily moisture to preserve life. Sandstorms roar like raging beasts, tearing apart everything in their path, and gigantic sandworms, revered and feared creatures, patrol the desert in search of prey, their undulating bodies plowing through the sand with terrifying power. Arrakis is more than just a barren planet. It is the core of a galactic empire. Everything about this place revolves around melange, known as the spice. This drug, extracted from the sands, is the key to longevity and foresight. It is what maintains the economic and military stability of the entire galaxy, controlled by the Fremen and Emperor Paul Atreides, who has made Arrakis the heart of a vast star empire. Paul, now known as Muad'Dib, is the emperor who once dreamed of freeing his people from oppression, of offering justice and hope. But that dream has morphed into something dark and twisted. From the palace in Arrakeen, the capital of Arrakis, Paul looks out across the endless expanse of the desert, where every grain of sand seems to echo with his own inner conflict. He feels the weight of responsibility crushing him, like an invisible cage that prevents him from escaping. Deep within, he knows that he has become a captive of his own myth, of his own legend, as the Messiah of the Fremen, a godlike figure who has brought about a holy war, a jihad that spreads like wildfire across the known worlds. For Paul, every decision comes with a price. His visions, a blessing that allows him to see glimpses of the future, are also a curse that locks him into a cycle of inevitability. He knows that any misstep could destroy him, his family, and even the entire empire he has built. With each passing day, the conspiracies against him grow, fueled by the power factions he once sought to ally with or destroy. The Bene Gesserit, the order of women who master mental and genetic abilities, hate him for having escaped their control. The Spacing Guild, whose pilots rely on the spice to navigate the stars, fears him. And the Tleilaxu, with their genetic experiments and dark agendas, watch him with lust, waiting to take advantage of his downfall. In the silence of his chambers, Paul looks into the completely blue eyes of Alia, his sister, marked like him by the power of the melange, and those of Chani, his lover and confidant, who is his only anchor in this life of power and betrayal. Those eyes, reflections of a world full of dangers, constantly remind him of the fragility of his position and the uncertainty of his destiny. Chani, with an almost inaudible voice, breaks the silence that weighs like a stone on them. "Can we still avoid this fate?" she asks, her voice filled with a fear that Paul understands deeply. He does not answer. She knows that deep within her soul, the answer she fears has already been sealed. In the silences between her visions, in the echoes of her own mind, she senses a dark and terrible truth, that this fate may be as beyond her control as the sands of Arrakis, swept and shaped by the relentless desert winds. Part 2. Shadow Dreams and the Poisoned Gift. Each night, as silence descends on the palace chambers, Paul is plunged into a storm of prophetic dreams that envelop him in disturbing images. A child, his son, never born, appears and disappears in the shadows. In the gloom of his visions, the figure of Chani, His beloved and the mother of this son who will never exist lies in a bed, wasted, fragile, and pale as death. Her face, emaciated and devoid of the vitality that has always characterized it, sends out a silent plea to him. Paul approaches her in her dream, tries to touch her, to wake her, but a thick shadow looms over her, an intangible presence that paralyzes him. The weight of these visions threatens to consume his mind. He knows that prophetic dreams are not just a warning, but a manifestation of possible futures to come. What does this shadow mean? What price must he pay for the power he has seized? Day after day, Paul sees Chani before him, lost in the folds of a destiny that seems written in the sand. Then, as a cruel response to his visions, comes Scytale, a Tleilaxu master. His presence exudes a calculated calm and an intent that is hard to fathom. In the eyes of others, this visitor is a simple emissary of the Tleilaxu, but to Paul, Scytale is much more. He represents the echo of those shadows that smother him in his dreams, the reminder of a dark power that lurks beyond his control. Like a stalking predator, Scytale watches Paul, studying his mannerisms, waiting for the right moment to make his move. "We bring a gift for the Emperor," Scytale announces, his voice sharp and calm. His words fall with a coldness that belies the true intentions behind the gift. Paul looks at the gift the Tleilaxu have brought, and his heart shudders. It is Duncan Idaho, his faithful friend and trusted warrior, someone who died long ago to save him. But this is not the same Duncan. He is a Gola, a recreation of flesh and memory, a living body built on a foundation of death. Paul knows that accepting this Duncan is not a simple matter of forgiving the past. This Gola is laden with hidden agendas. He can see it in his metallic eyes, in the movements that try to imitate humanity, but fail in some almost imperceptible nuance. Duncan Idaho is no longer the same. He is a mask, a suit of flesh and blood covering a sinister purpose. Despite everything, Paul, trapped by his own fears and longings, accepts this disturbing present. That night, his sister Aelia, who has also been touched by the spice and shares some of his prophetic gifts, approaches him with a warning. "The prophecy binds you, brother," she tells him in a stern, almost accusatory tone. "If you do not break the cycle, the entire empire will fall with you." Torn between his responsibilities and his love for Chani, Paul feels the weight of Aelia's warning. His own sister, the only person in the world who can understand what power means, confronts him with a truth he himself has been afraid to accept. Breaking the cycle, is it even possible? What if the price of breaking it means losing Chani? Aelia watches in silence as doubts build in her mind, like a dark torrent that threatens to sweep her away. Ultimately, Paul makes a choice, driven both by a desire to protect his own and a need to uncover the Tleilaxu's true intentions. He accepts the Gola, aware that in doing so he allows in a symbol of his own vulnerability. This new Duncan Idaho is not just a man, he is an enigma, a silent threat, and paradoxically, a spark of hope that drives him forward. Part 3. The Invisible Network, Betrayals and Sacrifices. The atmosphere on Arrakis is oppressive, as if an invisible storm filled with mistrust and ambition engulfed every corner of the empire. Paul senses danger in the air, in the murmur of the shadows that loom over his kingdom, and in the eerie silence of the halls of his own palace. Arrakis, the desert that was once his refuge and home, has now been transformed into a stage for betrayals and conspiracies that he can barely control. At the heart of this tangle are his own allies turned potential enemies. Princess Irulan, his forced wife, resentful of her lack of a place in Muad'Dib's heart, and humiliated by seeing Chani as the only one in whom he places his love and trust, becomes a linchpin for those who yearn to see Paul fall. Irulan, caught between her duty to the Bene Gesserit and her own ambition, joins the growing group of conspirators, stoking the fire that could consume Paul. She knows that her position as consort to the Emperor is an empty game without a son to inherit the throne, and this absence is the crack that allows her enemies to plot to undermine the Atreides bloodline. For their part, the Spacing Guild, whose very existence depends on the flow of spice, is concerned about the near-absolute power Muad'Dib wields over Arrakis. They know their monopoly on intergalactic travel could crumble if Paul chose to restrict the spice. The Guild, a mysterious and ancient group, views Paul with a mixture of fear and disdain, silently preparing their own weapons to confront him if necessary. Meanwhile, the Bene Tleilaxu, always in the shadows and motivated by their insatiable desire to manipulate those they consider pieces in their genetic chess game, see in Paul the opportunity for an unprecedented experiment. His ambition to shape and alter the Atreides bloodline becomes a veiled threat, constant proof that those who once supported him now see him only as an obstacle. In the midst of this conspiracy, Chani, desperate to bear him a child, resorts to extreme and risky remedies, knowing that her inability to conceive leaves Paul vulnerable. Paul, tormented by visions of his death and his inability to stop his fate, watches helplessly as she wastes away in her attempt to perpetuate his bloodline. He feels that every time he allows Chani to continue these treatments, he is consenting to the sacrifice of his beloved in the name of the throne. Yet the movement against Paul is not limited to whispers and stealth. Finally, Scytale, the enigmatic Tleilaxu master, shows his true nature. In a tension-filled confrontation, he makes his intent clear: "Give us what we want, Muad'Dib, or you will lose that which you hold dear." The words bite into Paul's heart, like a slow poison that creeps into the depths of his fears. Paul realizes that the price of his resistance may be too high. In his mind, the shadow of Chani on her death becomes an ever more real threat, a fate sealed if he continues the course of his confrontation with these dark powers. The Gola Duncan, Idaho, the recreation of his old friend, lingers near Paul, a figure of apparent loyalty and a disturbing symbol of the Tleilaxu's intentions. Paul watches him, searching his eyes for any vestige of the friend he once knew, but all he sees is his own fragility reflected in this revived figure. Duncan, a distorted mirror of his former self, reminds him that even his closest allies could turn against him. Part 4. Chani's Death and the Last Act of Loyalty. Chani lies weakened, her face pale and marked by exhaustion, gripped by an incessant pain that threatens to take her life. In a last-ditch effort to bring into the world the child she so desires for Paul, she has put her own existence at risk, a decision that her beloved emperor views with a mixture of helplessness and horror. He knows that all his power, all his visions, will not be enough to protect her from this fate that seems inexorable. All around him, the conspirators move their final pieces, a web of betrayal and manipulation that now traps him with no way out. At the moment of his greatest vulnerability, the Tleilaxu unleash their masterstroke. They activate a hypnotic compulsion implanted deep within Duncan, Idaho, Paul's Gola and former friend. Without warning, Duncan becomes a dangerous puppet, driven to attack the man to whom he swore loyalty. A devastated Paul watches as his friend becomes a deadly threat, a living symbol of the betrayal that brews in the shadows of his own palace. The Tleilaxu have turned their relationship of trust and friendship into a weapon. With superhuman strength, Duncan fights against the Tleilaxu implants and conditioning. In a tense instant, he breaks free from the mental grip that forced him to attack. Exhausted and reeling, Duncan falls to his knees before Paul, his metallic eyes filled with regret and sorrow. "I am sorry, my lord," he murmurs, shaking. In that moment, Paul understands that the Tleilaxu sought not only his death, but also to break the last vestige of humanity he had left. This betrayal strips him of one last certainty, showing him that the price of absolute power is the loss of everything that was once sacred and true in his life. However, the worst tragedy strikes when he turns his gaze to Chani. Exhausted, life is slowly slipping away from her, and he knows that nothing can save her. In her death throes, Chani smiles at him, her last act of love, and Paul feels his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. In the end, Chani dies in his arms, leaving him alone in a room that now seems infinitely cold and empty. Her child, the one she so desperately wanted, survives, but victory feels like absolute defeat. In that moment, Paul feels the true weight of his decisions and the horror of his legacy. He knows that everything he has built has been at the cost of the sacrifices of others, and the price of his power is the loss of his own being. Part 5. The Price of Divinity. A man lost in the desert. In a decision that seems to tear him apart, Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, decides to give up the throne he had conquered and sacrificed so much for. Years of war, Betrayal and visions of dark futures have eroded his spirit. He knows that the empire he built is a prison more than an achievement, a monument to personal sacrifices and irreparable loss. Staring out into the horizon, Paul takes in the vastness of the Arrakis Desert, that ocean of sand that was once his refuge and his home. Now, every grain reminds him of the broken promises and blood spilled in his name. On his last night in the capital, Paul faces the silence and loneliness of his chambers, an atmosphere that seems to reflect his wounded and worn soul. He remembers Chani, his only true love, who accompanied him until his final days and died to give him a son. The shadow of her absence envelops him, as if the desert itself took hold of his heart. Every decision, every vision and sacrifice have converged on this moment of bitter realization. He has lost everything that truly mattered to him. The price of divinity is humanity, he murmurs, as the weight of those words falls upon him with the force of a revelation. Before leaving, Paul entrusts the throne to his sister Aelia, a choice he knows is precarious and could lead to his own destruction. However, Aelia, with her wisdom and inherited gifts, is the only one who can sustain the empire in his absence. Despite his decision, Paul feels the pain this will cause in her, but he cannot continue the path he himself began. As he walks away from the city and into the desert, his steps are lost in the sand, where his figure disappears into the vast landscape as a simple man, leaving behind his legend and the weight of his name, Muad'Dib. The desert greets him, eternal and relentless, and Paul feels a melancholic peace as he disappears into the dunes. Now his destiny fades like a shadow at dawn, leaving an empire that still has to face the echoes of his reign and the shadows of an unfinished prophecy. Get the book at planetalibro.com.